Well, here it is. It's 5 o'clock Pacific, so I'm going to jump right in. Welcome, friends, to a Desmos Do-It-Yourself webinar. This is focused on building your own activities using our Activity Builder platform. And we're actually going to dive in a couple of minutes to one specific activity and then look at how we might build some of those pieces of that activity. We won't build a full lesson from scratch on the webinar, but we'll also look at ways that you can modify existing lessons as well, and then you can choose your follow-up steps afterwards. There's also a couple of links and a couple mentions that I'll make of some more advanced building techniques and where you can push your own building a little bit further. But largely this will be a somewhat introductory to kind of medium level webinar, and there's some links for everybody to dive in at the level they want afterwards. Before we get into any of the actual content, I'd love to just do some introductions. I'll lead out. And as I'm sharing out, I wonder if folks would just share their name, where they're from, and what brings you to this webinar. You might make mention of what you do, whether you're in the classroom or supporting folks who are in the classroom, or you might mention something that just caught your eye as you saw this webinar and signed up for it. So we'll do introductions in the chat window, and I'll offer a bit of an introduction for myself. My name is Michael Fenton. I live in Fresno, California, Central California here, and I taught junior high and high school math for 11 years. And about 4.5 years ago, I joined the team at Desmos for what we call the teaching team. And I'm part of a team that builds, you know, if you have your microphones on, if you could just mute those, that'll lead to a smoother webinar. Yeah, so I work within the teaching team as part of the curriculum development team. So I feel like it's a bit of a dream job. I get paid to build lessons and to watch those lessons unfold in classrooms and to take what we learn from classrooms and go back and try to build even better stuff in the future. So I'll carve out some space now. Maybe folks can type out name, where you're from, and what you're interested in, what brings you to the webinar today. Looks like we've got some high school math teachers, some middle school math teachers, a few mentions of calculus. Got some folks from Canada, love it. Hello from Australia. My wife was actually born in Australia. Nice, I'll leave a few more seconds. She was born in Melbourne, moved to the States when she was 5. Leave another half a minute or so for those responses to roll in. Feel free to answer that after the fact as well if you are just joining us here. I'll also mention that I'm a proud father of 4, and 2 of the 4 are in the other room. So we're hoping that nobody barges in with an emergency, but we'll roll with the punches as they come along. And all right, let's jump into the next item here. If you're still typing out your response, feel free to continue with that. The first thing I want to do is just take a brief look at this Lego prices activity. And I mentioned it's a hands-on look, but we're not going to go full on lesson facilitation. I'm not going to hand out a class code and invite folks to dive in deep. The hands-on approach will be either hands-on, because you're going to click through on your side using this webinar or this Google Doc agenda that we have, or you can just watch as I click through some of the screens and call attention to some of the design principles that we've incorporated into this lesson. The reason we're going to spend a few minutes looking at this lesson and not go all the way into it is there's just not enough time in a 1-hour webinar. But also I want to get our feet wet just a little bit with this before we dive into the activity building stage of the Activity Builder webinar. So we have a sense of what this looks like in its finished state, so that we can build from scratch as we go. Looks like the video feed sticks a little bit. I may actually turn off my face in a few minutes if that continues to be a problem. I think the browser-based content is going to be the most important here. All right, let's take a look at this first screen. Here we're asked to make a prediction. So we get some context. Mackenzie built the small Lego set. It cost $5.49, and Caleb built the large Lego set. How much do you think the large Lego set cost? So maybe you can jot down some of your guesses in the webinar chat. I'll give a few seconds for that, or you can scribble it on a Post-it note or just commit to something in your own mind. I definitely make my students punch that into the Activity Builder. Here I see a $25 guess, a $50 guess, I'm going to run with that $50 guess. And notice this button here, it said share with class. We'll circle back to that later on as we look under the hood at how some of these activities are built. If we were running this activity with the full class, I would see 3 of my classmates' responses here. Just random selections from the class, so I get a sense of how folks are doing. On the next screen here, we're invited to sketch a relationship. So one way to make a more accurate estimate, a more precise estimate, and I noticed that even just a handful of these responses, we've got $25 all the way to $200. That's quite a wide range of guesses. And I'd love to use the power of math to see if we can narrow that range of guesses. Maybe we won't all end up with the same exact guess in the end, but can we use some mathematical modeling to narrow that range of guesses? And one of the ways that we might do that is through a sketch. So here, the next challenge for students is to sketch what they think the price versus pieces graph might look like, and then to explain their thinking. So I'm thinking that, you know, 0 Legos probably costs $0. More Legos probably costs more dollars. And I've got a few choices here. Like, do I think that the price is going to kind of like taper out? Do I think it's going to increase like even faster? Or do I think it's going to be kind of nice and steady? You know what? I actually think it's that nice and steady approach. And I'm going to use the line tool on our sketch tool here just to sketch that out. Now, folks who might be familiar with using activities, because here you are in a webinar about building activities, you might be familiar with the teacher dashboard, where all of my students' responses are streaming in, and I can showcase those to lead discussions with my students. What do you notice about this one? What about these two side by side? Which one do you agree with and why? Just lots of different ways that I can spark discussion here at the beginning of this lesson. I might explain my thinking here, so I'll just say profound words. Go here, whoops, go here, and I won't take up too much of our time with my fabricated response there. Here's the next thing, and notice that we're getting a little more precision as we move through the lesson. That's a common feature of Desmos activities, is that we start rather informally and then build to more formal approaches. So here I'm asked as a student to drag this movable point to create a line that might model this data that we have for several different Lego sets. In fact, I've got 8 different Lego sets, including, yeah, that's a 43-piece, $5.49 Lego set. That's the one Mackenzie put together back on screen 1. And then I also have some other data points along the way. When you finish, continue to the next screen. So here's my original estimate, that $50 estimate, although it was called out that the estimate might have been $50 Canadian. So if somebody could do the conversion for me in a Google search, that'd be fantastic. But let's pretend for a moment that it was $50 US here. All these prices in blue are in US. I'm now going to use my model to see if I can get a more precise prediction. And so I've got a couple ways that I can do that. I can click to drag here. Notice that that Lego set is 1,005 pieces, just a tiny bit more than 1,000. So I could click to drag and see that it looks like about $121. So I'll put 121 in there. Notice that my new calculation lands pretty much right on that red line model that I've created. There's another way that I could approach this. Here, Desmos is serving up the equation. So this lesson is not about finding equations, but it is about using and interpreting equations and thinking about ordered pairs and the graph and the equations and what they mean in context. So one thing I might do here is just multiply that coefficient by the number of pieces and then share that with the class. And notice now I've got my calculation. It is like spot on that red line. Looks like $122, $123 is my estimate there. I can keep going and talk about what the slope means in context in terms of Lego prices, talk about whether or not the y-intercept should be 0. Does that make sense? I can go on and actually watch the reveal. Think about how that compares to my $50 original prediction and my $122 final prediction. Almost there. And there we go, $119.99. I'm feeling really, really good about my 122, 123 guesses. Final prediction is more accurate than the original. Like, why do you think that was the case? Like, more words go here, maybe profound ones, maybe talking about the power of mathematics. And then here's an extension, if I have some time, which I won't get into the details here, but any Star Wars fans, you may have noticed that some of those Star Wars sets are super, super expensive. This one actually retails for $500. So what would the number of pieces be if this model actually is a reasonable model? So record your answer, explain your strategy, and so on. So let me hop back to our webinar agenda here. We did some brief intros, and then we just looked through an opening activity. Far too fast to get a sense for what it really feels like in the classroom, but at a deep enough level where we can start making reference to some of these screens from an activity author's perspective. And I'll call attention to some specific details as we get a little further into the agenda. Here's what I'd like to do now is, oh, and somebody's got the conversion for me on the 50 Canadian. Thank you so much, Brad. I appreciate that. The next thing I'd like to do, though, is to look at some of the principles that you may have seen in that Lego prices lesson and just talk about them in a more general sense. I think the hardest thing that we do at Desmos, and the hardest thing that I rack my brain on day by day and week by week as I collaborate with folks on building lessons, it's not actually like, how do we build the graph? Although like that can be very challenging at times. And it's not, how do we get the footage for that reveal? And it's not even the wordsmithing of the note or the explain prompt, even though all that is quite challenging. The most difficult thing is the core idea, the core element of a lesson. How are we going to motivate mathematics? What's the driving force or the storyline of a lesson going to be? And as we built lessons over the first few years that the teaching team was part of the team at Desmos, we realized that there were certain patterns that unfolded that led to what we thought were strong and powerful lessons. So we actually codified these several years ago, and we've been building on these ideas ever since. So this is a growing list of things that we keep in mind as we build lessons, and it's certainly subject to change in the future. One of the things that we do is we try to incorporate a variety of verbs and nouns, and Match My Line is a great example of the ways that we do that. Stephanie's got a link for you folks in the chat menu if you want to look more closely at this blog post later on. Another thing that we do that I think was actually very much alive and well in the Lego prices lesson is that we ask for informal analysis before formal analysis. So I want you to think for a moment about what modeling often looks like in a traditional textbook. I think it rather looks like screen, where are we? Here you go. I think it rather looks like screen 4. It's like, hey, here's a model, here's an equation, here's the graph, here's some points in the coordinate plane. Check out the scale and the labels on the axes. Notice the precision of the vertical axis label, price in dollars. All of this stuff is very, very helpful. But at Desmos, we find that it's sometimes not very helpful as the first experience within a lesson. And so we try to push some of that formal thinking to later on, and instead invite students in less formal ways. Not that we're gonna end in that informal place, but we think of it as a bridge to that higher level of formality or abstraction. So there's actually 2 instances at the beginning of this lesson tailored toward this building principle, that we begin informally and move to more formal approaches. The first one is that we ask students to make a prediction. And we even have this language, like, what do you think the Lego set might cost? Just inviting any response. And notice that from a group of math educators, folks who know a thing or two about the content that we're dealing with here, there was a huge range of responses. We've designed a question here that invites a huge range of responses. And nobody right out of the gate has any sense that, oh, I can't do this lesson, or my guess was a bad one. It's just inviting a bunch of guesses so that we can have a conversation as a group and have a launching point. Notice the second screen. This is another place where we just pause and sit in that informal place for a little bit longer than maybe a traditional lesson would. We ask students to sketch what they think the graph might look like, and you can learn a ton from student sketches. Maybe they draw something like this, and you have a conversation about functions and what this means and why there's different prices for different numbers of pieces. Or maybe students draw something that goes like this, and you have a sense that they think that the number of pieces might increase and the price would decrease. You can, instead of saying students are right or wrong, you can take what they've input and say, let me tell you what your graph says. Is that what you meant to say? And there's obviously quite a lot of formal thinking that unfolds over the following 6 screens, but we often ask for informal analysis before formal analysis. We often try to create an intellectual need for new mathematical skills, and this lesson actually has it right on screen 1. Students may not feel like particularly inclined to go track down the answer, but I find that this is slightly more motivated than if we just jumped right into screen 4 and said, hey, what do you think the price would be? Use mathematics to find a precise answer. Instead, we invite students like make a guess, and there's just that little bit of buy-in. Like, I kind of wonder if my guess is closer than my classmates' guess. I kind of wonder if my second prediction is better than my first prediction. So we try to develop a need for those modeling skills that unfold in the rest of the lesson. And I won't bore you with going through all 12, or actually technically there's 13. We've got a bonus principle at the end, but I won't bore you with all of those. I just wanted to point you to this resource and hope that it serves you well as you build your own lessons for your own students, or modify existing lessons with a better sense of the principles at play when we built those lessons in the first place. But there's lots of great principles that we keep in mind here. The one other thing that I'll add is that we never try to incorporate all of the principles all at once. It's just a lesson would feel overstuffed, and I think the main storyline needs to be the mathematics, and the principles serve the mathematics. The principles serve the students as they engage with that content. All right, so back to the agenda. We had that opening activity, and then a quick look at our Desmos activity design principles with a link right here, and also a link in the chat window if you want to navigate to that later on. And now here we're going to dive into what, for me, I think will be one of my favorite parts of our time together. I'm hopeful that it is informative and helpful for you. There is a chance that it could be a little bit boring. I'm going to click some buttons on my screen and point out some things. And if you find your attention wandering and you want to open up your own additional tab and poke around with some of the things you see me playing with, feel free to do that. If you want to hang tight all the way through and just watch as I click through, maybe jot down some notes for things that you want to follow up on later, you're absolutely welcome to do that as well. So first things first, if we're going to walk step by step through the creation of several screens in Lego Prices, I need to head over to where we start building activities in the first place. And so that is teacher.desmos.com. You can actually get there from just straight up desmos.com, which maybe I'll start with that. Here's our lovely homepage. Right here in the middle, we have teacher.desmos.com. This is where you can find and build your own classroom activities. We'll chat later on about some of the other links on this page, but let's dive into teacher.desmos.com. And then if I go on the left sidebar and click the second link underneath your activities, it says custom. And here you'll see a bunch of lessons that I've been working on with some colleagues over recent days and weeks. Your view will be different based on what you have and have not created up to this point in time. But I want to draw your attention to this link in the very top right corner. You can build a new polygraph. We're not going to get into the details of that on this webinar. What we will dive deeper on is new activity. This opens up our activity builder interface, and let's call this Lego Prices Webinar Edition. And I'm going to click that Start Building button. Notice that I have my title up here. If I want to change the title at any point, I'm welcome to do that just by clicking up here in the top left. You might recognize or might think that this looks somewhat familiar to, say, like Google Slides or some other presentation software. And think of it as Google Slides, but with interactive dynamic mathematics that invites students to engage with that directly rather than just passively watching a presentation. So I can easily add additional screens. I can give those screens titles at the top. I can add any of these components, more on that in just a moment. And I can click here at the top where it says details, and I can give my lesson a description, choose whether or not it's accessible to anyone else in the world or only me and my account. And there are a couple of other features that you see on this screen that you at least don't yet have access to. Things like mixed text input. There's some goodies that we're working on, and we like to beta test a lot of stuff before we roll it out to everybody. All right, back to the screens territory. I've got all these different screens. Let me actually click to delete a few of those. And now I'm going to bring my Lego Prices activity side by side, and I'll spend some time going back and forth between these two. The first thing I'm actually going to do, though, is click this 3 dots menu and hit copy and edit. And what I get when I do that, and this, if you remember nothing else from our time together, this right there might have been worth the price of admission, so to speak, on its own. You can copy and edit almost any Desmos activity that anyone has made. Maybe you want to add a screen. Maybe you want to delete a screen. Maybe you want to change the names on a screen. Maybe you want to Take a lesson that was focused on linear functions only and expand it to include quadratics or something else. You can do all of that by starting with the copy and edit button. You get this lovely copy of prefix at the top. And the reason that I did that is I would like to go through these screens and think about some of the structure and then reproduce that in my own bare bones, rather lackluster activity builder that I have right here. So what's the first thing that I have? Well, let's turn it over to the chat menu. And if you folks could just call attention to some of the, we call them components. You might call them objects or sections of the screen. Can you jot into the chat window some of the components that you see included on this first screen right here? I'll give maybe 20 seconds for a few folks to type in there. All right, I see folks calling out the answer box. We call it an input field, and there's two flavors. We've got the math input field here. See some folks calling attention to the note here on the top right. We've got the title at the very top, and then we have this image on the left. Okay, so how are we going to recreate all of this in my activity? Well, first things first, I kind of read it left to right. I want an image. So I'm going to click across the top one of these options that feels like image. And I actually don't see the word image here, but there is this one here called media. And this is actually sort of what's the best way to describe this? Two birds with one stone isn't the right thing. It's sort of the opposite of that. Anyway, you get two options built into one component here. You can drag an image or a video onto this particular screen. And so I'm going to click choose file to upload. And I've got this image that I prepared ahead of time. Click open. It's kind of like attaching an image to an email. And check it out. We have the beginnings of an activity. Notice that we make the image very large because there's no other content on the screen. So let's go back and think about something else. Well, I have this note here on the top right. Let me go ahead and grab all of that text. Whoops. And go to this second tab and click note. Now I have an image on the left and a note on the right. And I could type all of that, or I think you can imagine me typing that. I'm just going to paste the text in here. And notice now I've got my image on the left, my title at the top, and my note on the top right. Let's go back to this screen and hit preview. Side note, when I'm building a lesson, let's say building a lesson takes me, I don't know, on and off for several days or weeks. Let's say over the course of building a lesson for an hour, I probably hit that preview button at least once every couple of minutes for that entire hour of building. It might not be something that you folks do. It's something that I find incredibly helpful. And it kind of centers me on the thing that I think is most important. What is the student experience? What do they see? What do we ask them to do? And by seeing that preview, I get to keep my mind on those key questions. All right, so what's the difference between these two screens? Here I've got, this is the official one, and this is the one we're building now. Well, I noticed that the title is different. So let me actually X out of this preview and change this to make a prediction. I'm closing the gap between these two screens. I've got, let's see, just one more thing, one main component here, and it's this place that we typed in 50 at the beginning. So on this side, I'm going to add an input. And I mentioned earlier, we've got two flavors of text, two flavors of input. One of them is text. So I'll show you what that looks like. This would be if the main thing you're expecting from students is words. There's another flavor of input, and that's the math input. And notice that we shrink the input field and we automatically stylize things like variables and exponents and expressions and fractions. And obviously, I'm not going to make this my guess for how much the Lego set costs, but we have all of that beautiful formatting built in for students with the math input field. Math input fields are fantastic for just numbers as they are. All right, so what are the differences still? I noticed that someone in the chat, Scott Miller, called out the fact, no, where was it? Somebody called it out. Oh, Jacob said there's no teacher moves. And so here at the bottom of our official one, we have some advice to a would-be facilitator of this lesson for what they might do in the dashboard or what they might say to students or what they might expect on that screen. So that's one more key piece. And I don't know if you can see it, but here at the very top, we have this light blue outline of this tip for teachers. So I go over here and it's just gray. So I can actually click here and type some words here. And then notice now in the preview, I have some teacher moves. So again, to save you the trouble of watching me type things out, I will actually just copy that entire teacher tip, paste it here. And then now I'm somewhat optimistic that as far as the eye can see right now, it looks like we have a rather, it's not identical. There's one thing in the top right corner that's a little bit different, but I'd say this is a close enough match for now that we'll move on. This orange triangle offers a little bit of a warning, and we'll talk more about that as we get into some pro moves in the last section of our time together. All right, so we've built a screen. There's no graph. We just got an image, a note, and we asked students for a math input. We asked them for a number. I will draw your attention to some of the response or some of the options here for my math input. I can ask students to explain their answer. So after they type 50, now we get a place where they can type some of their words. Maybe I don't want them to explain. Maybe I just want them to go with gut instinct and not have to worry about justifying their answer. And then I believe this last one is a button you might not have yet. Stay tuned for future updates. All right, let's take a look at another screen. Now, my colleagues who are on the call are going to have to remind me, because it's been a little while since I've done an Activity Builder webinar, and we have rolled out quite a few authoring features, some of which are admin only. So I think that this is not admin only. I think this is something that everyone can do. I'm going out on a limb and sharing it here, and I can get some verification in just a moment. But if you have an activity that has a screen that you think is just great as it is, you can lift that entire screen and drop it into your new activity. So I'm gonna look at screen 2. Let's say I don't wanna recreate that from scratch. What I can do is here in my screen selector on the left, just make sure I have that screen selected. And then I'm gonna hold Command and press C. You could also go up to your browser window and choose Edit, Copy. And it's copy paste, but for an entire screen. You noticed earlier I was copy pasting text and titles and teacher tips. Now I'm copy pasting an entire screen. This can be a really powerful tool if you have, say, several. All right, and Dave Sable says screen copy is available for all. Thank you so much for that confirmation. Fantastic. That's one of my favorite features in activity building. If I have a screen that is rather similar to one that I want in my new activity, just go lift that screen from another activity. If you see something in a released Desmos activity, that's a thing that you can do. Or just open up the activity in your own copy and edit feature, or your own copy and edit copy of that lesson, and just copy paste that screen into any lesson that you want. Now, for some of the more sophisticated activities, you might end up with a screen that only partially works, because some of the screens are connected to each other. More on that coming in the last part of our time together. And I just got a reminder for what the move is. It's copy paste. So any way that you can copy paste text, you can copy paste a slide from within one lesson to another. And there is a reminder of the keyboard shortcuts in the chat window there. And I'll make sure we've got links to appropriate spots on our support website for folks to remember that later on. Okay, so check this out. We have 2 full screens of our activity. We built one from scratch, and then we just brought the other one in right away. And what I'd like to do now is build the 3rd screen sort of from scratch. So let's take a look at that 3rd screen. And recall, this is where we had the movable point, and there was a line that was connected to that movable point. We had the axis labels, we had the grid, we had the scatter plot, all of this stuff. So I'm gonna build as much of this as I can. And I actually think we'll be able to build all of it. So I click that lovely teal button and I get a new screen here. And then let's think about some of these features. Actually, I just have 2 main ones. On the left, I have a graph, and on the right, I have a note. So I'll go over here, graph and a note. And in fact, one of the things that I do as I'm building lessons is I don't start in Activity Builder. And this is something that I think about 2.5 years ago in a workshop, a colleague and I sort of stumbled across this idea that we would invite folks to do some lesson building planning on paper and then turn them loose in Activity Builder. And the quality and the quantity of ideas was just so much stronger and more plentiful in that brainstorming away from Activity Builder space, that's actually how I build lessons at this point. That's how I brainstorm. That's how I sketch out what the 10 screens might be. I often do that a little bit on paper and pencil, and then a whole lot in Google Docs. I'll just make a bullet list of here's what screen 1's going to be like. Here's what screen 2 is going to be like. And I often ask myself these questions: what will students see? And what will I ask them to do? Those are the two main questions that guide me on each of the screens. Okay, so what will students see? Here they'll see a graph, and they'll see a movable point, and they'll see a line. So let's see if we can open up this graph. And let's see, here on the left, my graph goes from -200 to 1500. So I'm going to change the x-axis to go from -200 to 1500 with a step size of 400. We get minor tick marks at every quarter of that 400, but 400 for the major. Vertically, it looks like I've got step size of 25, and it goes from -50 to 250, -50 to 250 with a step size of 100, and I've got those quarter of 100 minor tick marks. All right, like I said, I hit preview all the time. These are looking rather similar, not identical. There's some other features. Let's work on those other features. So I'll open the graph again, and I recall that the horizontal axis was number of pieces, and the vertical axis was price in US dollars. A little shout out to my friends outside of the US with that specific reference there. All right, now we've got, yeah, this is starting to look even better. Let's think about the title, build a model. Cool, getting even closer. And it looks like actually, maybe my window doesn't go all the way to 250. Maybe it goes to something else. Let's take a look in here. Yeah, -40 to 240. I think I'm fine with my -50 to 250. That seems okay to me. The note will be rather boring, so I'm just gonna grab that note and copy paste it. And these two are looking very, very similar at this point. Major difference is like all the good stuff in the graph. Like the graph is just kind of an empty shell at this point. So how do we get some more goodness in there? Well, the first thing I wanna do is make sure that I have all of those points in that scatter plot. And to do that, I'm going to, let's see, open up this data thing right here and say that it's kind of difficult to go back and forth between the two. So one thing that I've got this tab and that tab, and I kind of want to see both of them at the same time. So what I'm actually going to do is I've got a larger window, a larger monitor in front of me, and I'm only sharing part of it. I'm going to click this Edit Graph on Desmos button. And can I get I spend so much time in admin only land that that's another feature. I don't actually recall if that's available to everybody, but I wonder if Scott or Jay or Dave can remind me. That's available to everybody. Thanks so much, Kurt. I appreciate it. Next time I'll do a little better homework on which features are admin only. But this is a really lovely way to extract a graph from a lesson and then drop that graph into another lesson. The main thing I'm doing it for right now is I want to pull this window off to the side where you folks can't see it, just so that I can have an easier way to transcribe my data. I don't want to do too much too quickly. I want to show you what some of the editing interface of the graphing calculator actually looks like, in case that's a place you're not super familiar with. All right, so here we are. This looks rather like the calculator at desmos.com. I have this lovely plus button in the top left corner where I can add a bunch of different items. One of the items that I can add is a folder, and I'm kind of an organization freak when it comes to my graphs, so I throw a folder down before I do any other work. You can also just type the word folder and we'll turn it into a folder for you. I'm going to call this folder data, and inside here I'm going to add a table. So I could click on plus and click on table, or guess what you can do? You can type the word table and it just turns it into a table. And now I'm going to transcribe those numbers that I can see just off screen. This is kind of the tedious part, but by going through it, you're able to see some of the other tips and tricks that I use just to make my day-to-day lesson building a little bit smoother, like folder and table and extracting a graph. $39.99. Actually, we've got two different sets with that same price, $89.99. And oh, interesting, the set with the greatest number of pieces is not the most expensive. That's kind of interesting. All right, so what's the difference between this graph right here and this graph right here? Well, one of them is color, so let's deal with that. There's two different ways you can change the color. One of them is to click this Edit List button. It's actually just that gear icon near the top left, and then click once and choose any of these colors. I'm going to choose blue and hit done. And so now I'm one step closer. Let me close up that data folder and then move on to the next thing that I want to do, which is, let's bring a new folder in. This is my movable point and line. Okay, so the first thing that I want is a movable point. And I actually have to go back here to remind myself what was the behavior. So check this out. We let that movable point go anywhere in the actually not anywhere in the quadrant, anywhere in the viewable graph. It goes into quadrants 2, 3, and 4 if we let it. And then we just send a line that goes through the origin and through that particular point. So I'm gonna go back over here and think, how could I get a movable point? Well, first things first, you can plot an ordered pair like 400, 100 just by enclosing it in parentheses. And earlier I showed you how to change the color by pressing this gear. You can actually just do a long press or a click and hold, and it'll bring up that style menu, and I'm going to change it to red. But the problem with this is that this point is not movable. It's stuck. It's static at 400, 100. But as soon as I replace 400 with some undefined parameter like a, or maybe x sub 1, oh, x sub 1 is not a good idea, and here's why. That's actually the name of my first column in my table. So let's go with a. And then instead of 100, I could go with some other parameter. I'll go with b. You could have done q, you could have done anything else that's not already taken. y1, for example, is already taken. Side note, x and y are special variables. You can't use those for movable points. So now I've got a and b, and Desmos doesn't know what to do because a and b are not defined. But Desmos also has been in this territory before. This is familiar ground. So Desmos invites us to press all. So when I press all, we get these lovely sliders. So I can now adjust the vertical and horizontal position of that movable point, either with these sliders or by dragging the movable point itself. The next thing that I want to do is send a line that goes through that point. So let's drag this to, say, 800 or 100. Can I get it exactly there? Oh, nice. All right, how do I get a line that goes exactly through that? Well, it's y equals 100 over 800 times x. But here's the bad news. If I drag this movable point, it no longer matches. Like, that line is static. But if I define this dynamically, not just with those constants 100 and 800, but with these parameters that are attached to sliders, the 100 came from b and the 800 came from a. Now I've got b over a, or as you may have noticed, my vertical change compared to my horizontal change. Now that movable point controls that line. That line is defined as a line passing through the origin and a point at a comma b. There's some other features that I could add here. In fact, let's go back here. And this lesson was built a little while ago, and we haven't added some of our additional polish. Here's a thing that I would consider doing is, like, maybe restrict so that x has to be greater than 0, or maybe don't. Maybe you want to invite your students to think about what those points in quadrant 3 would mean in context, or maybe you want to have that discussion pushed off to the side and not be a thing that you're worried about throughout this lesson. I'm going to go ahead and leave this unrestricted since it's a better match for that original. The next thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that the initial position here is at 200, 0. So I'm going to change these values. I could try to tediously just line it up, and I was successful earlier with the 800, 100, but I can actually just change this to 200 and change this to 0 and get there immediately. Now I hit done and preview, and I manipulate this. Go over here, manipulate this. These screens are feeling rather similar. Notice we've got the US dollars as a difference. The minimum and the maximum are just slightly beyond what our original min and max were. So we've done it. We've built a screen. Now, there is some more detail baked into this, but again, that gets into some more of the advanced features that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So the next thing that I want to do is show you how you can not just extract a graph, but actually inject a graph into an existing screen. So let's say I have this screen 4, and let's go ahead and copy and paste the entire screen. Again, that's Command C to copy, Command V to paste. If you're on a PC, you're probably going to use Control C for copy, Control V for paste. And here it is, I have this graph. If you do me a favor and ignore those little warnings, those are actually connected to that more advanced stuff we'll talk about shortly. But let's say I've made a grave mistake and I deleted my data on accident and I messed up the window, I deleted my line. In fact, like, maybe I've just completely sabotaged most of this. Or maybe I've got just a brand new graph. Maybe it's like -10 to 10 and it's basically like I've got nothing in there. You can get your graph from another lesson into this screen without overriding the entire screen. So you can copy paste an entire screen, or you can inject just a single graph. And we're going to do the latter right now. And the way you would do that is you open up the graph that has the graph you want, click Edit Graph on Desmos. So you're basically extracting it from one place. And here's the magic. This is another thing that I think I probably use dozens of times every day, and it makes me very happy that this exists. Copy that URL. Again, whatever you use to copy normally. Command-C because I'm on a Mac, Control-C if you're on a PC. You can also go up to that edit menu on your browser and just choose copy from that edit menu. Bottom line, I've copied that URL. And then I go back here, and in any blank expression line, you just hit edit paste or Command V. And what it does is it imports the graph. It wipes out everything else that was in your graph previously. For example, if I drag this over here and then I paste it into a new expression line, it'll completely override everything I had in there. There is a handy undo button if that overriding was a bad move. But if you have a graph that you want to plug in wholesale, copy it, paste it, and you're on your way. And so check it out. What we've done now is we built a screen that has an image and a note and a prompt to invite some early student thinking. We have a sketch component with a note and a text input to invite them to sketch what they think the relationship could look like and then explain their thinking. Then we have a graph built with a dynamic movable point that controls a line to invite students to model. And then we have, and this is where it falls apart. This is where we need some of that advanced magic, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes. But we do have all of the core pieces that we need for screen 4 to basically function the way that these 4 screens function together. All right, I see a couple of questions popped up in the side. How did you get to edit the graph in Desmos? So it's actually pretty hard to see in some graphs and really easy to see in other graphs. Let me show you a very easy one. Here's an easy one because there's just so little happening in this graph, and actually the folder collapsed everything, and so it's just easy to see on the bottom left, edit graph on Desmos. However, if you have a longer list of things or a bunch of folders that are all open, you will have to scroll for a little while to get all the way down to the bottom, but it's always there, bottom left. And thanks to Jay and whoever else for answering those questions on the side. All right, so where to next? Let me hop back to this webinar right here, or the agenda here, and I want to talk for a little bit of time about copy and edit, and then previewing some advanced building techniques. And then I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, and I want to point you to some resources to continue your own activity building adventure. So I think we're probably at the point where building individual screens for Lego prices has sort of, it's gotten us what we needed to get out of this. Just a general sense of how this interface works, the different components, the fact that you can only add some components. You can't add 19 components. And we also automatically organize them in a way for you that we think will make sense to students. There is one other thing I'd like to show you here before we move into that advanced topic, and that's the activity description. So you can go over here and paste your activity description. I actually don't recall if keywords are an admin thing or not, but that's another thing that you could add here as well. If it is not admin only, that one might actually be admin only. Jay says they are admin only. Thanks, Jay. Shout out to Jay and everybody else who's supporting the webinar. Yeah, activity description is the thing that you have access to, so I won't fiddle with the other things there. Once you have all of your screens built, or just some of them built, maybe it's time to take a break, go make a sandwich, do something like that. You can save it as a draft or hit finish or publish. And then this is what it looks like. If I wanted to take a test drive of what I have so far, I could click create class code, or I could click to preview that screen and be off to the races, maybe pick it up tomorrow or next week to build the rest of that particular lesson. All right, back over here for copy and edit. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and so I can do a shorter description of how to do it and what it's for here, but I want to make sure everybody leaves our time together knowing exactly when you might want to use this and how to do it. So the when you might want to use it is anytime somebody else, and somebody points out to me that you might want to actually share your lesson with a colleague. And so you can go over to, There's lots of buttons in there you don't have access to. Let me not actually bore you with any of that. You can actually just click here, copy this link, and send it to a colleague if you want them to try it out. Excellent tip from Scott. Thanks for that DM. Okay, so where was I? We were talking about copy and edit. So let's go back to teacher.desmos. And let's say you found a fantastic new activity from here and you wanna make a change. Maybe it's from the inequalities collection. Notice we've got some collections of activities on the side. In fact, let's click view all. I noticed there were a few friends who signed on at the beginning. Do we have a calculus bundle yet? Let's check out calculus, not bundle, calculus collection. Nothing there. What if we just limit that to calculus? Let's take a look at the intermediate value theorem. So you might have found a lesson through collections or through just the featured activities or most popular or by search, or maybe a colleague sent you something or you found it on Twitter. But the bottom line is you have a lesson and you think it's all right, but you could make it better. And that's what we love at Desmos is teachers will take the stuff that we've built and customize it for their students, either in the delivery or maybe by tweaking a screen. You often know your students far better than we will. So let's say you have this intermediate value theorem lesson and you'd like to delete a screen or add a screen. How do you make that happen? Click on the 3 dots menu at the top right, click copy and edit. And there you go. You have your very own copy that no one else in the world can have access to unless you leave this link set here. The original author of the lesson, none of the changes that you make on yours will affect anything to their original lesson. This is just your own custom copy of the intermediate value theorem. Maybe you wanted to, again, add a screen or delete a screen, change the text on a particular screen, or maybe you actually just wanted to harvest a screen from the middle of this activity to use in a brand new activity of your own, and you want to copy paste that screen, copy and edit the lesson, go inside, maybe it's screen 5, copy that and paste it into your own lesson. So there's a bunch of different reasons why copy and edit might be helpful to you. Now, Jennifer points out that there are some activities that will not allow copy edit. And as I mentioned toward the beginning of the webinar, we do have some admin-only features that have some rough edges, and we often try to bring these features to everyone after we've smoothed out the rough edges. And sometimes we just retire a feature because we decide there's a better approach, either design-wise or technologically. So some of our lessons do have advanced features that do not allow copy and edit. And for some of the lessons, that'll change over time, or for some of them, that won't change over time. But the vast majority of lessons, I believe, are available for copy and edit. And you're always welcome to email me if you have a follow-up question about a particular lesson that you're trying to copy and edit. I'll make sure my email address is on screen as we wrap things up. All right, that may be enough about copy and edit, and we'll carve out some time for the Q&A later on. Here's the next thing that I'd like to talk about, which is some advanced building techniques. So if you go to teacher.desmos.com/labs, here you can gain access to a few of our labs. These are some things that, again, have some slightly rougher edges than the rest of our tools. We like to build our tools to be as intuitive and useful as possible, to have as low of a learning curve as possible, but also to have a very, very high ceiling. Some of these, especially this third one, they start out more powerful. There's not so much the like low floor, high ceiling. It's kind of like medium floor, very high ceiling. It's a very powerful set of authoring tools, but for this particular webinar, we're not going to get into the details. What I will tell you is that if you activate Computation Layer, you will have access to a far greater percentage of lessons from a copy and edit perspective. You don't need Computation Layer to use the lessons, but if you want to copy and edit, you probably want to turn on Computation Layer, even if you don't do a whole lot with Computation Layer. That being said, after you've turned it on, and thanks Stephanie for dropping the link in the chat window, there's an opportunity to learn more about Computation Layer in our documentation that's linked to from the labs page. But I actually think the most valuable resource, and I'll jump down to one of our resources now, this third bullet. I think one of our most valuable resources for activity authoring generally, especially with advanced authoring tools, is our Computation Layer forum. It's cl.desmos.com. This is a place where you'll run into me, Jay, and a bunch of other colleagues and a bunch of other users who are using Computation Layer in powerful and interesting ways. So if you're brand new to Computation Layer, you've already got a community waiting to support you there at cl.desmos.com. All righty. And again, we are not going into detail on the advanced building techniques. Maybe that's something for a future webinar. Maybe that's something where we already have a webinar recorded, and Jay can maybe drop a link in the chat window if that's something that we have at the ready. I think that, oh yes, please, on advanced building. That would be super fun. Maybe we'll just sort of pick up where we left off in this one sometime in January or February. All right. Back to my agenda. We do have a few more minutes. I got a +1 from Michelle. Appreciate that enthusiasm there. Maybe that'll encourage us to put one of those on the calendar soon. The thing I'd like to do to wrap up our time together is to just point you to some resources. And again, I said at the top that some of this won't go into the depth that maybe you wanted. My hope is that you learned some tips and tricks and some general ideas from the principles that we use to build lessons to the tools themselves. But I'm hopeful that everybody at this point has something they can do next, whatever the level of difficulty is, whatever your degree of experience is. And so I'll say that you should definitely be familiar with teacher.desmos.com, whether you want to build lessons or use them. We have a bunch of free, fantastic, I'm biased, but I think they are fantastic lessons at teacher.desmos.com. We really have a sweet spot at middle school, but there's some lessons that range from 5th grade through 12th grade, including some calculus and some statistics. Maybe you'll help us build even more calc and stats lessons as well. So you should be familiar with teacher.desmos.com. We recently added something called collections. This is a way where you can find a group of lessons gathered around a particular topic, sometimes even presented in the order that you might teach those in. For example, inequalities, you might move through them in this particular order. Three lessons focused on the number line, starting with just inequalities, moving to compound, and then ones involving absolute value. And then we've got linear inequalities on the number line for point collector and in the plane for point collector lines. Point collector lines is one of my favorite lessons, in large part because of the challenge creator. If you've never heard of challenge creator, I'd invite you to check out point collector lines as a great exemplar activity. All right, so in addition to free lessons and free tools for building at teacher.desmos.com, we also have a support site. It's learn.desmos.com, and that's a great place to go to. You can get there from, desmos.com/ actually just desmos.com. If you are at desmos.com, you can get to any of the things that we're talking about today. Some require more clicks than others, which is why having that webinar agenda at the end can be very handy. But I will point out that this option on the right, learn.desmos.com, this is a great tool, not just for learning more about building lessons, but also learning more about the calculator. For example, this top left teal button, the graphing calculator, if you click that, we've got a menu of features that you can learn. Scott's given a shout out for my monotone voice. Yeah, if you're having any trouble sleeping, just put some of these videos on in the background. I'll lull you to sleep with my monotone voice. Anyway, we've got a menu of calculator features that you can learn more about. Maybe you want to learn more about sliders. We've got an interactive tour. We've got a short video. We've got some graphing challenges to see if you can take what you've learned and move further. And we've got some example graphs and even some suggestions for what you might explore next if you were interested in that particular topic or that particular feature. In addition to all the features on the graphing calculator that you can look at, we've got resources to help you create your own lessons. And that was the link that I included here. We went 53 minutes with no interruptions. Let's give a shout out to a little 7-year-old girl. Hey, can I have 5 more minutes before I join you?
Why?
Sorry, everybody.
Why is Caleb having his candy cane?
Oh, I'll have to chat with him later about that. I do need you to run along. I'm almost done with this meeting. Thank you. You can hang out in here if you want to be quiet, but we can't talk about candy right now. So sorry for the unprofessional finish to the webinar, but appreciate everybody's grace. LearnDesmos.com/create is a direct link to resources where you can learn more about creating your lessons. We did not talk about all of the components. We did talk quite a bit about graphs. We didn't talk about tables specifically. We did talk about tables within a graph, but not a table component itself per se. Sketch components, media, whether it's images or videos, notes, we talked about those, the 2 flavors of input. We have multiple choice, marble slides if you've activated that, card sort. I love paper card sorts and I love digital card sorts because of the information that streams into the dashboard. And then we also have the ability to, again, turn on some of these things in the Desmos Labs page. I've already mentioned the CL support forum. This is cl.desmos.com. And then also I'll wrap up with this, and then I think we've got about 5 minutes for QA, which I think should be a good chunk of time to answer a few questions. I saw in the introductions, we have at least one Desmos fellow on the call. And if you want to learn more about like what is the Desmos Fellowship and is it something I might be interested in, this link here at the bottom of our webinar agenda gives you all the details, and you can even sign up to be notified when the next cohort is accepting applications. The next cohort will be cohort 5. We have 4 amazing cohorts of really thoughtful, just kind and amazing educators that we get to hang out with in person for a weekend and then online for the days that follow that. All right, enough about the Desmos Fellowship, enough about what I had to say about Activity Builder. I'd love to see some questions pop up into the chat window. And here's what I'll do. I'll stick around for a couple extra minutes afterwards if there's any lingering questions, and maybe Stephanie and Jay can help me keep an eye there. But let's just type as much as you can and I'll answer them as quickly as I can. Jennifer asks if Dan Meyer has thought about incorporating his 3-act tasks into Desmos activities. So we actually have built some 3-act tasks into Desmos lessons, but in terms of turning the entire catalog, that's not a thing that Dan has or the team has done wholesale. It's been more selecting, picking, and choosing specific ones. Damien asks if challenge creation is something we can incorporate in our own design. Currently, it's not available to everybody. It's an admin only kind of thing. Jacob asks if there's a limit to the length of videos that can be incorporated into an activity. Gosh, that's an amazing question. I think maybe, size limit. I was thinking duration limit. I don't know why my brain went to duration. Kurt says it's 100 megabytes. Kurt has answered all the other questions I couldn't answer correctly. So I'm gonna go with what Kurt says. Thanks, Kurt. Jay just linked to Penny Circle, which is one of Dan's 3-act tasks that has been converted to Desmos Activity Builder. Graphing stories isn't exactly a 3-act task, but it's something that Dan created. Actually, when that little girl who just walked in, that's Mackenzie, my 7-year-old, when she was born, Dan launched something called Graphing Stories. So you go to graphingstories.com. Well, we've turned Graphing Stories into a Desmos lesson. And Jay comes through with the link. This is fantastic. You can link YouTube videos. Oh, like in the note or something like that, or in the teacher tip. That's actually a pro move, is if you want a teacher to have access to a resource, but don't want it to be sort of in student spaces in the note, you could drop a link in a teacher tip, and that's something that someone would have access to. Or you can drop things in the activity description as well. I think we have time for a few more questions, and it can be really anything about activity building with Desmos or anything about Desmos generally. Michelle says, love the pro move tips. Awesome, I love them as well. And hopefully the engineering and design teams keep adding more pro moves for us to share with you folks. I've got a question. Stephanie, do you know if this webinar was recorded?
This webinar is recorded, and we will add captions to the webinar, and then we will post it publicly and email it out to everybody who registered.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. And shout out to Stephanie for just putting this, like organizing, doing all the logistics and making it easy for all of you folks and me to show up. Is there a link to the agenda somewhere? Yeah, there is a link if you scroll all the way to the top of the chat. Also, I've got it on the screen here, and I'm gonna paste it here at the end. I think that sometimes in Zoom, actually, I don't know if this is true. It's true with some webinar software, that if you aren't in the chat when a link is posted, maybe you don't actually have access to it. Thanks.
Correct.
Yes, you can. Urgent update, everyone. There is a package on the porch. Any suggestions for folks planning to use Desmos virtually that is not in the same room as their students? I don't have a ton of experience doing that at all or doing it well. I do know that some folks who have just like permanently asynchronous classrooms, like for online learning, have done a bit of experimenting with that. I just know that the main use case we have in mind is helping to build a more social, creative, and delightful classroom that sort of leverages the most of humanity when we've got a teacher and 30 or so students in the room. But as you learn about how to facilitate things remotely, we'd love to hear what's working and what's not working and how we could better support you. Is there a plan to make Desmos accessible on mobile devices? That's a really hard problem, and it's one that we are continuing to work on. I don't have any sense of when we'd have an update there. Let's see, love info about the cohort. That link in the agenda will give you info there. What's the best way to start building an activity builder? I'd recommend starting in a Google Doc and just jot your notes down there and then start putting things together in the activity builder once you have a vision for where you're headed. All right, I think we might be to the end.
Well, Michael, I'm going to jump in because there's one question that we missed. Will
Yeah.
there be additional webinars like this? There will be additional webinars going into more advanced activity building and computation layer coming up in January.
Thank you so much. And I do see one more here. Can students see their work later? If they log in, and that can be with a Desmos account or a Google account, then they complete the activity, then they go home, and then from any device, if they log back in, they can just go to student.desmos.com/history, or they can click, I think there's a history button somewhere nearby if they just go to student.desmos.com, and they can access all of the lessons they've done when they have been logged in. So it's a few seconds of hassle to log in, but I find it is well worth it, so students have that record of their digital work. All right, friends, there are some links to the store if anybody wants to get some sweet Desmos socks or shirts or sunglasses, stickers. I don't know if we have those for sale. Maybe they just get packaged occasionally with the fancier products like socks and shirts. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your day. I imagine some folks are on the East Coast, and so it's already 9 p.m. I don't even know what time it is in Australia right now. I don't know what time it is. Where else do we have? Oh, Canada. I guess we got a lot of overlap on time zones there. Bottom line is, grateful for you being on the call, grateful for all the great questions. And I'm hopeful that you have at least one or two things that you picked up from the webinar that you're excited to go try. Maybe not right away. Maybe you're going to get some sleep first, but tomorrow or next week, or hey, over the break, you got some prime activity building time coming up in the near future. So thanks again, folks. I will see you online. Oh, and I said email, so I'll make it clear right here, michael@desmos.com. If there's anything from the session that pops into your mind later that you'd like to follow up on, my inbox is always open. It's just michael@desmos.com. Thanks again, everybody. I will see you folks in the future.